All right, welcome back again. Today what we're going to be looking at is the start of World War II, how it got started over there in Europe and in Asia, and we'll also be looking at what was the United States doing during those opening years since we didn't join until 1941. All right, so to get started, we have to look at what was going on in Europe with their government structures. After World War I, we had the rise of totalitarianism throughout Europe. Totalitarianism is where the government has total control of society, people's lives, just everything. And so it occurs in several different countries in Europe. Communism took hold in the Soviet Union. After the Russian Revolution in 1917, the Soviet Union became communist when Lenin led the communist revolution. He died shortly after and was replaced by this guy, Joseph Stalin. And Joseph Stalin is going to rule as one of the evil dictators in history, murdering millions of his own people to advance the overall interests of the country. There's another belief called fascism, and we will usually associate fascism with Germany, but I'm going to wait a minute, because it first takes hold in Italy, when in 1922, a guy named Benito Mussolini rises to power. Okay? You see, that's early. We don't think of a lot of these things taking place in the early 20s, but Mussolini became the leader of Italy in 1922, so very, very early. In Japan, there is totalitarianism, but there also becomes this sense of militarism, a glorification of the Japanese military. In 1926, Japan gets a new emperor. His name is Emperor Hirohito. He was very young when he took over, and he is going to be advised by a variety of military leaders, and gradually he's going to turn control of the country over to a lot of these military leaders. One of them is a guy named Hideki Tojo, and he became Prime Minister of Japan in 1941, and they're going to take Japan into its aggressive directions. And then, of course, we have Germany. In Germany, they had established a democracy after World War I, and that democracy was plodding along. It was somewhat successful. It was making gains, especially as the economy was starting to improve. And then, in 1933, after the start of the Great Depression and after the financial collapse in Germany, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party took power. And, of course, they're going to rule Germany with an iron fist. So why did totalitarianism take over in these places? The main reason is the economic chaos that existed in most of these countries. Okay? The Great Depression helps push it over the edge, especially in Germany. Okay? Each leader, whether you're talking about Lenin and Stalin, the fascists in Europe, or the military leaders in Japan, they all promised financial prosperity. Okay? This is especially true in Germany, where after the Great Depression starts, the economy just spirals out of control. This right here are German children out in the streets playing with bundles of money. These are marks, German marks, the German money, and they're playing with these out in the street, stacking them like blocks. The economic situation in Germany had gotten so bad, they're not worried about anybody coming down the street and stealing this money. And so it was okay to let your kids play with it. There's also social instability in these places. You know, people are lost. With the Germans, their emperor has abdicated. They had a democracy. It's not quite working. In Italy, Italy is being looked at as a second-rate country in Europe. And so each country, you have people there that are looking for some kind of return to what they viewed as their historical greatness. In Italy, they were the center of the Roman Empire. How come they've fallen so far? Japan is looking to dominate the Pacific and the lesser nations that they see surrounding them. In Germany, they're looking for a renewed empire. What happened to the mighty Prussian Empire? What happened to the empires, the Holy Roman Empire before that? Germany needs to embark on the Third Reich, the Third Empire. Another reason totalitarianism took hold, and it has to do with those feelings of return to greatness, and its feelings of humiliation that these countries suffered at the end of World War I. Japan had joined the Allies in World War I, and they had attacked German possessions in the Pacific, and yet in the Treaty of Versailles, Japan is basically ignored. And in their view, this was very insulting. They felt that the European powers didn't treat them the same because they weren't white. And so, to the Japanese, the only way you can get respect from the Europeans is to beat them. Okay? Italy was part of the Allies during World War I, and in the Treaty of Versailles, they felt that they did not get enough. They were expecting to take territory from Austria-Hungary, and they didn't get everything they want. And they felt it was because the Allies had treated them unfairly. The Germans, of course, feel treated unfairly because they were punished by the Treaty of Versailles. And Hitler is going to prey on that national humiliation that a lot of Germans felt they suffered in the Treaty of Versailles. And so Germany's army, their navy, their air force, the size of those are going to be restricted to really ridiculously low levels. For the size of a country that Germany was, the number of people that were allowed to have in their army was just ridiculously low. The other problem with that is you have guys that have joined the army and they planned on making this their careers, and they were forced to leave. They are now unemployed, angry, and, for lack of better terms, trained killers. Germany also had to pay these huge reparations payments, these billions upon billions of dollars to the Allies that was crippling their economy. And finally, they had to give up control of not only just giving up land and giving it away to the Allies, but also giving up control of their own territory. There's an area in Germany called the Rhineland, which has a lot of industry, it has a lot of natural resources, and the proceeds, the profits from that region were actually supposed to be transferred to France for a period of years after World War I. And so this was horribly humiliating for them. And of course, ultimately, all of these things are going to lead to the conflict that becomes World War II. Okay. This conflict, these acts of international aggression, begin in 1931 and just continued throughout the decades. So, as the Great Depression had just started, these dictators are able to solidify their power and go on the offensive. The League of Nations, which was created at the end of World War I to prevent this type of aggression and to prevent another war, is going to respond to these things with what we call appeasement. Appeasement is giving in to an aggressor's demands, giving them what they want, hoping that they will stop. Now, the first country to actually get involved in this aggression was Japan, but when we talk about World War II, usually we just spend our time talking about Germany. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to focus on the Germans. In 1938, Hitler had built up his military sufficiently, and he had gained enough from the Allies. He had marched in and taken over the Rhineland. He had rearmed, and the League of Nations had let him do this. So in 1938, Hitler is going to engineer something called the Anschluss, that is, the joining between Germany and Austria. The people of Austria have an election on whether or not they want to become a part of Germany. the election is filled with fraud. But at the end of the election, the Austrians supposedly have voted to join Germany. And even though this was prohibited in the Treaty of Versailles, the League of Nations lets it go. Later in 1938, there's something called the Sudetenland crisis. The Sudetenland is this area in the country of Czechoslovakia, which was created after World War I. It is the mountainous region here in Czechoslovakia. And Hitler demanded that that be turned over to Germany. His excuse being there are 3 million German-speaking people there. It's another problem when Woodrow Wilson went to the Treaty of Versailles, and he said we must respect the self-determination of all people. Where do these people want to live? The Allies just drew lines. These German people probably would have wanted to belong to Germany, but instead, the Allies just drew lines. And they ended up being in Czechoslovakia, which gave Hitler the excuse to say, I want this, and if I don't get it, I will go to war to take it. And that scared the Allies, that scared the League of Nations, it scared Britain and France. And so in late 1938, they'll hold something called the Munich Conference. And at the Munich Conference, Germany, Italy, Britain, and France, the 4 nations that it was decided had an interest in this, meet, and they agree to give the Sudetenland to Germany. Notably missing from the conference was Czechoslovakia. They did send people to the conference, but they were not allowed to attend because they were not invited. But they give this to Hitler and they say, okay, you have the Sudetenland, and Hitler says, thank you, this is all I wanted. I just wanted the Sudetenland. I am happy with this territory. Then in March of 1939, Germany turned around and invaded Czechoslovakia. And again, the League of Nations and Britain and France appease Hitler and let him do it and do nothing in response. Now later in 1939, there's going to be something called the Danzig crisis. Again, Hitler is looking this time at the city of Danzig, which is in Poland. And Hitler says, the city of Danzig is German. That's what that poster over there on the side says. Danzig ist Deutsch. He says Danzig is German. There are German people living there. It's a German city. I demand Danzig. Give it to me or I will go to war. Britain and France this time decide to stand up a little bit to Germany. They think they have an ace in the hole because on the other side of Germany is the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union is starting to look at Germany kind of worried. Fascists and communists really don't like each other. And so the British and the French think if anything happens, the Soviet Union will join them to stop Germany. Then on August 23rd, 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union announced something called the Nazi-Soviet Pact, or sometimes it's called the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, an agreement between the two countries not to attack each other. Now, within the treaty, there was a secret agreement to divide Poland in half. Hitler has told the Soviet Union that Germany will be invading Poland, but Germany's only going to take so much. The Soviet Union's allowed to take the rest. That paves the way on September 1st, 1939, for Germany to invade Poland. So make sure you mark that date. That might be one that you might be asked on a test. That's a critically important date. When World War II begins. And so, in June of 1940, Germany is going to, after taking over several other countries throughout Europe, in June of 1940, France is going to be invaded, and they will surrender. There will be an area called Vichy France. It's kind of the southern part of France, a puppet government of Germany, if you will. They officially joined Germany as part of the Axis powers, but they're kind of the collaborators. They're not going to be thought of as your average French opinion on German occupation. And then from July of 1940 to October of 1940, Germany is going to engage in something called the Battle of Britain. It's the air war over Britain, where Hitler was looking to break the spirits of the British people and force Britain to surrender. Okay? Now, fortunately, Britain's new prime minister, this guy, Winston Churchill, is going to rally the people, and he is going to declare that Britain will never surrender. And by October of 1940, the British were able to fight off the German Air Force, and Britain was able to maintain its independence. Okay. Then in June of 1941, again, after starting to take over southeastern Europe, Germany is going to invade the Soviet Union, breaking the Nazi-Soviet pact and bringing the Soviet Union into the war on the side of Britain. We would say the Allies, but really it's just Britain and the Soviet Union at this point. Okay. And so, by the end of 1941, okay, remember, World War II started in September of 1939. By the end of 1941, you have these areas here in yellow, this pale yellow area, that have been taken over by Germany. Okay? And even if you look down here in North Africa, there's some territories in North Africa that will also be owned by the Germans, or controlled by the Germans and or their allies. Okay. Now, what are we doing during all this? It's very simple. The United States is remaining isolated. We talk about our foreign policy in the 20s and the 30s being one of isolationism, mainly because of what we're seeing during the 1930s in Europe and our attempts to avoid getting in the middle of it. After World War I, we saw the destruction that had been caused by World War I. We really didn't experience it because we didn't get in until the very end, but we feared that a new war would result in an even larger loss of life than World War I had. And there was also a fear of foreign entanglements. Don't ally yourself with other countries. They'll get you into things you don't want to get into. This is the main reason we had never joined the League of Nations. And we didn't want to get involved in conflicts that we didn't feel we were a party to. After the Depression, our thinking remains with, well, we need to avoid entangling alliances, but there's also a kind of a re-examination of why did we join World War I in the first place. Part of the reason for this re-examination is going to be a skepticism that exists within the American people of business. It was felt that businesses were responsible for the Depression, and so Congress puts together a committee called the WWII Committee that is going to investigate the, quote, true reasons that the United States got into World War I. And the WWII Committee is going to come to the conclusion that it was actually American businesses that pushed us into World War I. Now, never forget, the main reasons the United States joined World War I was the unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmerman telegram. But the WWII Committee is looking for someone to blame and a reason to keep us isolated, to keep us from getting into another war like World War I. And so they blame the businesses, and so therefore they can say, look, if there are any calls for us to get in there and stop what we see happening in Europe, it must be the businesses. They are merchants of death looking out for profits and looking to make money off the death and destruction. Okay? And so, because we blame business and because we're looking to make sure we do not get involved in a conflict like this, the government is going to pass a series of laws we call the Neutrality Acts. Now, each one of these begins with the term the Neutrality Act of. So you have the Neutrality Act of 1935, which outlawed the sale of weapons to any country that was at war. If the president declared that a country was at war, they were now off limits to weapons sales. Okay. 1936, we go a step further and pass another Neutrality Act, which outlawed loaning money to countries that are at war. And in 1937, we'll go even further, and we will outlaw the transportation of certain other materials to countries at war, and we will also outlaw the transportation of people to these countries at war. Each of these is designed to keep Americans away from the war and to keep us out of a position where America might get blamed and or attacked and or have Americans killed, which might make the American people demand war. And essentially, this is the way we're looking at it. Okay. This cartoon, and if you know who Dr. Seuss is, he does a lot of World War II propaganda cartoons. But this was his interpretation. Okay. The United States is ignoring the problems that exist in Europe, assuming we will be okay, when instead we need to be preparing. Now, that's all through the 30s as we kind of see the clouds of war forming in Europe. Then, when World War II does start, Roosevelt is going to recognize there is a good guy and there is a bad guy. And Roosevelt is going to recognize we need to help Britain. The problem is these neutrality acts have kicked in. Now, Roosevelt is going to get Congress to go along with a couple things. The first one is something called the cash and carry system. Roosevelt and the government will allow the British to purchase weapons and other materials, provided that they pay in cash and that they carry the supplies away on their own ships. So if you can imagine a British ship docking in New York Harbor, bringing the briefcase full of cash, buying the guns, putting them on their ship, and headed back to Britain. If the Germans attack that ship in the Atlantic, no American will be killed. Because the British have paid cash, no American business or bank is going to be owed money. The payment will have already been made. There will be no reason for anybody to say, we need to go to war. The problem with this is, because Britain is on war footing, their economy can't handle that. And so the cash starts running out. Roosevelt will then engineer something called the Destroyers for Bases deal. In September of 1940, the U.S. and Britain will swap, will trade. We have 50 old warships lying around. The British will give us access to their naval and air bases in the Atlantic and the Pacific. Okay? These 50 old warships are laying around because, as part of Roosevelt's New Deal program, he actually got Congress to approve the building of modern, up-to-date battleships and aircraft carriers and other ships, with it being the idea of a New Deal program, that the shipbuilders were still out of work. Okay? But they held on to the old stuff because Roosevelt saw these things coming. But you can only make that deal once, because how often do you have extra destroyers laying around? So later on in 1940, Roosevelt is going to get Congress to go along with something called the Lend-Lease Act. At this point, we might as well have quit pretending we were not helping either side. Okay? The Lend-Lease Act goes into effect in March of 1941. And the United States is going to allow Britain to borrow weapons, with the provision that at the end of the war they will give those weapons back to us. Or, if the weapons are not in the same condition they were when we gave them to them, they will then pay for the damages after the war. We have joined the British in all but name. Roosevelt sold this to the American people because, clearly this is the United States helping one side. Clearly this is getting our fingerprints all over this mess. But Roosevelt sells it to the American people by saying this is like lending your neighbor a garden hose when their house is on fire. The danger is that the fire is going to spread to your house. If you give them the garden hose, they fight their own fire. You're just giving them the means to do it before it affects you. And after June 1941, the Soviet Union is going to get access to that same Lend-Lease aid as well. Now, people see what Roosevelt is doing, and a lot of people in the United States didn't like that. There's a group called the America First Committee. Okay, the America First Committee, some of the leading members of that committee are Henry Ford, Alice Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt's daughter, Charles Lindbergh. And they argued that Roosevelt was pushing us to war, and that we needed to stay out of it. And they will use arguments like, look, Germany is not a threat to the United States. Well, what is happening in Europe is Europe's business. They will argue that Germany actually didn't start World War II. It wasn't Germany's fault. No, they were pushed to do this. You know, all they wanted was a city. All they wanted was Danzig. All Britain and France had to do was give it to them. It's not really their fault. They're gonna lose support among the American people when several of their leaders make anti-Semitic remarks, anti-Jewish remarks. Lindbergh makes this. Henry Ford, in his company newspaper that he put out every so often in the Ford plant, would complain about Jewish bankers and how the Jews were causing problems. Actually, in some of his speeches, Adolf Hitler referenced Henry Ford. If you're Ford, that should have made you feel real good. So they're going to lose a lot of support, especially as people in America start hearing what's going on over in Germany. And now, the United States is, after Lend-Lease, we are going to start down this path to war. Okay? Who cares what America first thinks? We're starting down this path to war. Okay? In August of 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill will meet, and they will sign a document called the Atlantic Charter. It is the war goals that Britain and the United States had for World War II. What we are going to do when we win the war, despite the fact that we are not in the war. The biggest points of it were, first, self-determination of all people. Every conquered people will have the opportunity to choose what government they are going to live under. If you were independent and you want to be independent, you can be independent again. The second thing was the aggressors will be disarmed at the end of the war. Their militaries will be removed. And the third thing, when we get into the war, we will not seek territorial gain. For us, very similar to World War I. For Britain, something new for them. But neither side will seek to gain territory. It's truly going to be turned over to the people that live there for their own self-determination. And so all that's going on toward the end of 1941, and we are focused on the Atlantic, and we are focused on Germany, and we believe that something is going to happen to cause us and Germany to go to war. In fact, by November of 1941, American ships are firing on German ships, and German submarines and ships are firing on American ships. And even though we're shooting at each other, we haven't actually declared war yet. It hadn't gotten that bad, but we're in what's called an undeclared war, because we are shooting at each other. And we tended to ignore what was going on in Asia with the Japanese. Okay. The Japanese, through 1940 and 41, had been taking advantage of the situation in Europe, and they had been attacking British positions throughout Asia and the Pacific. And so, eventually, in 1941, the Japanese are going to go too far, and FDR is, after trying to convince them to stop, FDR is going to order the United States to embargo sales of materials to Japan, especially oil and steel, which they needed to keep their war machine running. He's also going to order the Treasury to freeze all Japanese assets that were in U.S. banks. That means if the Japanese have money in a United States bank, they are no longer able to have access to it. We have frozen that account. And this will lead Japan into their biggest gamble of the war, December 7th, 1941. We had expected that there was going to be an attack on the Philippines. It's the closest American possession to Japan, but instead the Japanese are going to execute a sneak attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Okay. They attack in the morning. This was the headquarters of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. And they caught the position completely off guard. Over 2,400 American sailors, soldiers, and airmen were killed, along with a few civilians. The fleet was heavily damaged. You see here the remains of the USS Arizona, which still remain sunk at Pearl Harbor. And they didn't just attack Pearl Harbor, even though it was the most devastating attack and the most shocking attacks. They did attack other positions around the Pacific. They launched attacks on Midway Island. They launched attacks on the Malay Peninsula. They launched an attack on Singapore. Okay? So there were all these attacks all over the place. And so the next day, December 8th, 1941, Roosevelt goes to Congress and asks them to declare war. And Congress will vote overwhelmingly. Now, of the two dates on this, the test would definitely be more likely to ask you about December 7th, the date which will live in infamy. So Congress votes to declare war almost unanimously. One person voted against World War II, and that would be this lady right here, Jeannette Rankin. You may remember her from World War I. She was elected to Congress before we joined World War I, saying, "I see war coming, elect me, and I will vote against any declaration of war." Well, in the 1940s, she saw the same thing happening. And she ran for Congress again and said, "Vote for me. I will vote against any declaration of war." And despite the fact that this one was clear, we had been attacked. There was an aggressor against us. She sticks by her guns, and she votes against World War II. And the same thing will happen to her after this vote that happened after her World War I vote. She gets voted out of office at the next election. Okay? So there's Jeannette Rankin. All right, well, that's the origins of World War II. When we come into class, we'll talk about what's going on in the United States during the war.